So, anxiety, forlornness, and despair. The first of these on page 18, we find that Sartre claims that human beings, in fact, are anxiety. We cannot escape the feeling of this anxiety, he claims. First, what is meant by anguish? The existentialists say at once that man is anguish. What that means is this: the man who involves himself and who realizes that he is not only the person he chooses to be, but also a lawmaker who is, at the same time choosing all of mankind as well as himself, cannot escape the feeling of his total deep responsibility. Of course, there are many people who are not anxious, but we claim that they are hiding their anxiety and fleeing from it. He goes on, he gives a couple of examples, and then he goes on page 20. For every man, everything happens as if all mankind has its eyes fixed on him and were guiding itself by what he does. And every man ought say to himself, am I really the kind of man who has the right to act in such a way that all humanity might guide itself by my actions? And if he does not say that to himself, he's masking his anguish. Now, what Sartre's trying to illustrate with this first term, anxiety, is that it is just the basic consequence of our situation as beings for whom existence precedes essence. In choosing ourselves, we're choosing all of mankind. And the total deep weight of our absolute responsibility, if our choices don't work out, what have you, falls squarely on each individual human being, right? It's just basically our situation. But most of us turn evasively away from this anxiety. We don't like it, we don't want to experience it. The responsibility for our whole existence is too much for us, right? So what Sartre is claiming here is that, quite frankly, most of us flee from our anguish by saying, it's not my fault, it's not my fault, I had no choice, it's company policy, I'm just following orders, right? And most of us have elaborate methods for, in a sense, deflecting, right, our freedom and our absolute responsibility for our choices, right? We do it every time we flip a coin, right? We do it every time we ask somebody else for advice and just agree with ourselves to follow that advice. Because then it's not as though we are acting and choosing ourselves, we're just doing what somebody else told us. We're just doing what the coin told us to do, right? But what Sartre wants to point out to us is that we cannot escape our absolute freedom in this situation. We chose to take advice, we chose to work at a company, we chose to flip a coin, we chose to live by the dictate of the coin flip, right? So it's all our choice and all our responsibility, right? There's no situation in our life in which this is not our basic condition, right? So anxiety is something we should, if we take seriously living a human life, feel. The next term, forlornness, I absolutely hate this definition, but nonetheless I'll start on page 21 with Sartre's definition, which he picks up from Martin Heidegger, right? When we speak of forlornness, a term Heidegger was fond of, we mean only that God does not exist, and that we have to face the consequences of this. The existentialist is strongly opposed to a certain kind of secular ethics which would abolish God with the least possible expense, right? And he references this movement around 1880 of a bunch of French philosophers and teachers who tried to say that God does not exist, he's a useless premise, and we can just move on with our lives without that. What Heidegger and Sartre want to point out is that it should be very distressing, this idea that God does not exist, or that if God does exist, and if God did exist, God wouldn't be in any position to help us because we would have to interpret, and even the theologian claims that if we cannot know God's will, right? So any ethics that originate from this transcendental belief, this faith, right, Well, we find that we, in a sense, do it ourselves. We're forlorn. We are the authors of our own morality, not just subscribers to them, right? So, right, Heidegger concludes this section on forlornness by claiming, in other words, there's no determinism. Page 23, by the way. In other words, there's no determinism. Man is free. Man is freedom. On the other hand, if God does not exist, we find no values or commands to turn to which legitimize our conduct. So in the break realm of values, we have no excuse behind us, nor justification before us. We are alone with no excuses. Right? So another method of turning away from our freedom, turning into bad faith, as Sartre would claim, right, would be to, in a sense, right, just turn to a rule book, right? Yank out your Kant's grounding to the metaphysic of morals, yank out Mill's utilitarianism, yank out the Nicomachean ethics, yank out Emily Post, and just do what you're told, right? But what Sartre wants to point out to us is that these books have no more authority than the choices that we're making, right? We're free, but in a sense we're free for nothing. Values, judgments, our morality, right, is something we choose, we author, and we hold sole responsibility for. So we are alone as freedom with no rule book whatsoever, right? So, in a sense, we're up the creek without a paddle. We're forlorn, right? Now, finally, right, the idea that Sartre is trying to convey to us is that we are condemned to be free, right? We're free with absolutely no excuses, right? Now, finally, on page 29, he introduces the term despair to us, right? And it's, again, annoying definition here, right? As for the term despair, the term has a very simple meaning. It means that we shall confine ourselves to reckoning only with what depends on our will, or the ensemble of probabilities which make our action possible. When we want something, we always have to reckon with probabilities, right? Now, that's a bad definition. But what Sartre is trying to convey with the term despair, right, is that basically we are absolutely free and absolutely responsible, choosing entities in a world that, in a sense, resists us or doesn't care about us, right? So, what I choose in the world, the actions that I take in the world, right, meet resistance, right? Sometimes don't work out, right? I can make the best choices, right? I can do everything in a sense right. I'm throwing out the term right as a validity claim that has no real basis because he hasn't given us the ability to determine right or wrong quite yet. But nonetheless, right, I can do everything by the book and it can still not work out. Right? The example I pull on quite frequently is, well, have you ever played a game of solitaire and done everything right, right? Made every move that was possible and still lost, right? Now, this is kind of foreign to our Western North American way of thinking, right? We like to think that if we play by the rules and make all the right moves, then everything in a fair world is going to work out for us, right? But what Sartre is trying to convey to us is that the world, well, we're free and responsible, and this gives us a lot of power and the ability to define ourselves, right, is a world that's not necessarily of our own choosing. We choose in a world in which we are subject to what the term is facticity, right? Facts of our existence, right? I make choices, but I make choices in the context of a world that's suffering a major economic downturn. I make choices in a world in which there are only so many possible choices, right? So I'm free and I define myself in a world that to some extent limits me, and this is what Sartre means by despair. Doesn't sound very fun, but he's basically trying to lay out the situation of human freedom.